born in Paris in 1949, and then my parents moved to Australia in 1952, so I grew up in Australia, and then I went to London when I was 17 and I was always painting and making movies, and we used to call them underground films in those days, 16mm films in London, and I made my first 35mm film, a musical, in 1970 called Trouble in Melopolis, a musical, and it was really just friends. Everyone was working for nothing, basically. It was produced by Eric Clapton. I've made many movies, at least 30, and they're all quite different. There's the documentary movies, Brother Can You Spare a Dime, Swastika, Double-Headed Eagle, and then there's the, what I call them, pop art movies. There's werewolf movies, The Howling 2, Howling 3, Communion, sci-fi. Well, you never know what the reaction to a film's going to be, and I just quit worrying about it. I just make the films as I like them and then hope that someone else will as well. In the case of Swastika, that reflects my interest in history and my family background, my dad's wartime activities. Swastika shows the Nazification of Germany, and in the process of making the film, we found, incredibly, Eva Braun's home movies, 16mm color film. My colleague Lutz Becker and I located them, and they had not been seen since the end of the Second World War, so that caused a bit of a sensation, and it's still, that footage is still used in most documentaries about Hitler and the Third Reich now. Swastika was shown at the Cannes Film Festival in 1973 and caused a major furore because no one had seen Hitler in informal film, let alone color film, and there was a visceral reaction, certainly from the French people in the audience. And they started yelling and screaming "assassin" at the screen. They threw chairs at the screen. It was an unbelievable event. They stopped the screening, and everyone had to return to their seats, and the film went on. But that was the birth of Swastika and the controversy. And that did absolutely startle me. I mean, I assumed that everyone knew that Hitler was evil. I didn't realize that apparently it was up for debate. It never occurred to me. So the film was made on the assumption that you realized that Hitler was one of the worst things that ever happened in history. And so this was an insight into Hitler the man. He was a demon in many ways, but up till then people had just seen him in his own propaganda films or in newsreels in black and white. And when you saw him in color, filmed with a sort of handheld, then you realized, it took away the mythical part of it. You suddenly realized, oh, this is a guy who played with kids and played with children, and that made it more terrifying to me. And there's a famous phrase by Hannah Arendt, the banality of evil, and these home movies, to me, really revealed how true that was, that these evil people are really banal, ordinary, not the kind of people you'd want to spend any time with at all. My family history was deeply involved. They were Jewish, most of them were German Jews, and as far as we can make out, and we've been investigating it very recently, about 9 of them were killed in Auschwitz. And I never really wanted to go there. You know, it was just painful. My father never wanted to go there, really, and they didn't talk about it much. But now I'm just interested as to what exactly happened and why it happened. And the more you get into the subject of the Holocaust, the more enigmatic and insane and crazy and inexplicable it is. Especially the children, the killing of children. That is just unbelievable to me now, even though I'm telling you now. I mean, they gassed 2 million children. So, you know, to what depths will humanity go? That subject does intrigue me. One of the things that I'm fascinated by, as well as history, is of course the history of cinema. As a filmmaker, I'm fascinated by early film, Lumiere, Méliès, And then when I got interested in the stereoscopic photography, I found that stereoscopic photography started in 1850 in England, and photographs were stereo photographs from 1850 on, basically. The Civil War in the United States was all shot in 3D, stereoscopic photography. Lincoln was the most photographed president in stereoscopic shots. So there's a lot of, I find it fascinating. I think other people will too. If anyone interested in cinema is going to be interested in this 3D film. They used 3D in the Second World War for reconnaissance. They put left eye and right eye, for example, on the wings of Spitfires, and they'd fly them over areas in Germany they were going to bomb, and the pilots could look in 3D, because obviously it'd be a much more accurate rendition of the targets if they're in 3D. So 3D's been around for a long, long time. It's only just become fashionable again with Avatar, and these older movies are now converting to 3D. But I loved 3D as a kid. I mean, I used to have 3D comics, Tarzan comics in 3D, the red and green glasses. So I always liked that. And I remember seeing a Three Stooges movie in 3D called Pardon My Backfire. And the Three Stooges were doing all this stuff in 3D. I'm sure that's why I'm still interested. My biggest challenge, without a doubt, and it still is finding the money to make anything. And it's just very, very difficult. It's hard enough to get a job, but it's even harder to raise the money to do your own movies. That's why you've got to be passionate about it, because it takes a lot of energy and a lot of rejection and a lot of explaining. And that's the toughest part. If you have your own vision, the challenge is to get the means to make it. I mean, unfortunately, films are expensive. They're cheaper now than ever, by the way. But a writer can use a pencil, and a painter can use a pencil as well. But a filmmaker needs equipment, and even digital equipment is very inexpensive now, which is great compared to making a film 20 years ago. But that's the main challenge. How do I get this done? An unlimited budget is a great fantasy, but sometimes the restrictions actually force you to do more creative things. Just getting back to my first film, which I thought it was a decent budget, was peanuts, $300,000, Mad Dog Morgan. Because we didn't have much money, it forced me into fast decisions, and we were shooting outside, so I used the landscape as a character because it didn't cost anything, but it was a spectacular landscape. And there's in Australia, and there's wonderful landscapes everywhere, but there's a lesson there, which is this. You try and use things in your films that no matter how much money you have or had, you'd still be doing exactly the same thing. If I had $10 million when I made Mad Dog Morgan, the beautiful landscapes would still be exactly the same. It just would have cost more. The crew would have been bigger. The cameraman would have been more expensive. So money is very important, clearly, but also in another way it's totally unimportant. It's what you're shooting that counts. Right now I'm working on too much. I'm working on a film called Continuity, which is about something called remote viewing, which is a military term for astral travel or psychic traveling. And I'm working on a documentary called 2 Days in Auschwitz, which is about 2 days I spent in Auschwitz over the last 2 years. And I'm working on a script about George Washington and another script about the French Resistance. My father was in the French Resistance. I think if you're starting out as a filmmaker, I would keep in mind this thing that Picasso said in terms of painting, but it really applies to film. And Picasso said, it's not enough to have an idea. The real process starts when you make it. And in the process of making it is when you find out what you're really making. And that really applies to films, documentaries and fictional films. In other words, you will find as you're directing, editing, photographing, filming, whatever you want to call it nowadays. Capturing is the word now. When you're capturing this, you'll find things happen that change in the process, that change where you were going, and that's really important. So people can sit around for years saying, I want to make this, I want to make that, I want to do this. But if you don't try and make it, you're never going to find out really what you're making.